In the year 900, the most important building in northern Europe wasn't a cathedral, a fortress, or a palace. It was a long, low hall, dim with smoke, sunk slightly into the ground, ringed by turf walls thicker than a man is tall, with a single fire burning at its heart. Inside, packed together against a darkness that could stretch for months and a cold that could kill an unprotected body overnight, lived an entire world. Free farmers, their wives and children, dependent kin, household servants, men born into bondage, oxen, sheep, goats, sometimes a horse, all sharing the same roof, the same air, the same fire. This is the story of the Viking Longhouse, the building that organized Norse life from the islands off Norway's coast to the new farms carved out of Iceland's interior. The scenes that follow have been reconstructed using AI, built on decades of archaeology sagas written down centuries later, and the patient study of objects pulled from post holes, hearths, and middens across the North Atlantic. If this journey into the Viking world fascinated you, leave a like and subscribe to Histamine's Archive, where we recreate history one place at a time. Around the year 900, the Norse world stretched across a long arc of cold coastline, from the Lofoten Islands north of the Arctic Circle, down through the fjords of western Norway, across to Denmark and southern Sweden, west to the Faroes and on to Iceland, where settlers had been arriving in waves since the previous century's second half. Eastward, along the great rivers running toward the Black Sea and the Caspian, Scandinavian traders and warriors were building the network of fortified towns that became known as the Land of the Russ. Across this sprawling, fractured geography, nearly every household, from the wealthiest chieftain to the humblest free farmer, lived inside a building of the same basic shape, a long, narrow rectangle, sometimes just 10 meters end to end, sometimes 30, occasionally much longer. At Borg in the Lofotens, archaeologists uncovered the foundations of a chieftain's hall stretching 83 meters, the largest Viking longhouse ever found. At Hrisbru in Iceland's Mosfell Valley, a longhouse built around 900 and excavated in the early 2000s measured roughly 28 by 10 meters and remains one of the best documented working farmsteads from the period. Building materials depended on what the land offered. In the forested regions of southern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, walls went up in timber, horizontal logs locked at the corners, or vertical staves driven into the ground and joined with crossbeams, gaps stuffed with moss and clay. Farther north, especially in Iceland and across the windswept North Atlantic islands where trees were scarce, walls were built from stacked turf blocks, sometimes 2 meters thick, faced with stone at the base and packed with earth at the core. The roof rested on 2 rows of internal wooden posts, dividing the interior into 3 long aisles, and was covered in thatch, wooden shingles, or another layer of turf, depending on the region. There were no chimneys. Smoke from the central hearth rose and escaped through a single roof opening, the lori in Old Norse, which doubled as the main source of daylight. Windows where they existed were tiny, shuttered slits, and doors were placed away from the prevailing wind. The whole structure functioned less like a house and more like a thermal shell, an insulated box built to trap body heat against winters that at higher latitudes could drop below -30 degrees Celsius for weeks on end. The fire sat at the center of everything, running down the middle of the hall in a stone-lined pit stretching several meters. The hearth burned without pause from autumn to late spring. It cooked the food, warmed the bodies sleeping along the side platforms, dried wet wool brought in from outside, and lit the smoky interior with a low red glow. Those platforms, raised slightly above the dirt floor, packed with soil and edged with wood, served as benches and workspaces by day, used for spinning, weaving, mending tools, cutting meat. By night they became beds, layered with straw hides, wool blankets, and furs, where whole households lay down in careful order. Where you slept, how close to the fire, how near the head of the household's high seat, said everything about your rank, expressed in the plainest architectural terms imaginable. At one end of the longhouse, usually behind a low wooden partition, sat the buyer. Through the long winter, the household stabled the animals its survival depended on: cattle. A free farmer's most valuable possession, came in from the first hard frosts of October and stayed until spring grass returned. Sheep followed in greater numbers, along with goats and a few pigs. Packed shoulder to shoulder, their body heat radiated through the partition and noticeably warmed the human side of the hall. The smell, the shuffling, the steam rising off their backs, none of this read as unpleasant to Norse sensibilities. It was the sign of a farm that was working. A house with an empty byre at midwinter was a house in trouble. The farming year that sustained all this was tightly compressed, with short summers and thin soils. Only the hardiest grains had time to ripen. Barley was the staple, sown as soon as the ground softened and reaped by late summer, with rye and oats filling in. Fields ringed the Longhouse, home meadows for hay to feed the animals through the stabling months, and rougher outlands beyond where sheep and goats grazed under the eyes of children and dependents. Kitchen gardens held peas, onions, cabbages, turnips, and other pulses. Slaughter came with the first hard frosts once there wasn't fodder left to carry every animal through winter. Meat was preserved by smoking in the rafters above the hearth, salting in barrels, drying in the cold air, or a distinctly Norse trick, burying in vats of soured whey, which kept fish and meat edible for months. The sea pulled its weight too. Households fished from small open boats, gathered shellfish at low tide, hunted seals on the skerries, and in the far north joined collective hunts for whale, walrus, and seabird eggs. Cod and herring, split and gutted, hung on wooden racks until the wind turned them into stockfish, hard slabs that could last years and travel long distances. A typical winter day's food centered on barley or oat porridge, flat bread baked on hot stones, cheese, butter, and skyr made from the household's own milk. Skyr, a thick fermented dairy product Icelanders still make today, was started from skimmed milk inoculated with a bit of the previous batch, then sealed in barrels where it kept for months. Butter went into wooden tubs, hard cheeses were wrapped and shelved above the rafters. Ale, brewed from barley, was the everyday drink for everyone. Children included safer than untreated water and a serious calorie source through the dark season. Mead, made from honey, was saved for the big feasts, oaths, marriages, the turning points of the year. These feasts weren't occasional treats. They were the central social and religious events of the Norse calendar. At the start of winter, around what would later be called Verturnetter, sacrifices secured protection for the cold months ahead. At midwinter came Jol, the long feast that's the direct ancestor of Yule, 3 nights of drinking, eating, and oath-taking. Come spring, more offerings went up for a good planting season. The Longhouse itself was the ritual stage for all of it. Animals were slaughtered, their blood sprinkled on walls and guests alike, the meat boiled in huge iron cauldrons over the hearth. The household head presided from the high seat. Ale and mead moved hand to hand in horn cups. Skalds, professional poets, recited verses honoring ancestors and gods. Offerings went to the Disser, the female ancestral spirits said to watch over the household, and to the major gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, Freyja. Call it religion, ancestor worship, or household cult. It was inseparable from the building it happened in. Protection took other forms too. The Longhouse itself worked almost like a small fortress. Thick walls, narrow openings, a single guarded door, shelter not just from weather but from the feuds that flared up between neighboring families. Around the year 900, Norse society had almost no centralized authority above the household and the local chieftain. Disputes over land, livestock, marriage, and honor were constant and could spiral into killings that demanded an answer. Violence got met with violence or with wergild, the carefully calculated payments that turned injury and death into measurable wealth. The institution holding all of this together in the absence of kings or written law was the the assembly. Locally free men gathered to settle disputes and witness agreements. Regionally larger assemblies pulled in chieftains and farmers from whole districts. In Iceland in 930, free men founded the Althing at Ingvalir, a national gathering historians often call the oldest parliamentary institution still functioning anywhere in the world. There, the law speaker recited a third of the legal code from memory each summer, keeping the law alive without writing it down. The social order inside the Longhouse was sharply layered. At the top sat the jarls, chieftains and large landowners whose halls were biggest, whose feasts were grandest, and whose oaths bound farmers and warriors to their service. Below them came the carls, free farmers, the backbone of Norse society, owners of land and livestock armed and entitled to vote at the Ing. At the bottom were the thralls, unfree workers, some captured abroad, some born into servitude, who did the hardest labor in field, byre, and kitchen, their lives the legal property of their masters. All three classes slept under one roof, but in carefully separated zones, ate from the same cauldron, but in carefully separated portions. Women held more real power in this household economy than the popular image of Viking life usually allows. The keys to the household stores hung at the mistress's belt. She ran the dairy, the grain stores, the meat and fish preservation, the textile production. The upright, warp-weighted loom standing at the back of every longhouse was the engine of an enormous economy. It produced the wool cloth that clothed the household, settled debts, and equipped the ships that made the Viking Age possible in the first place. A single sail of 100 square meters, the kind that powered long-distance ships, needed wool from about 2,000 sheep, roughly 200 kilos of cleaned fiber, and thousands of hours of spinning and weaving, almost all of it done by women. Across the Norse world, wool cloth functioned as currency in its own right. Marriage settlements were priced in lengths of cloth. Taxes and rents could be paid in it. Without the looms inside these longhouses, the longships never leave the shore. And they did leave. The same household that wintered around the hearth, slaughtered its pigs at first frost, and brewed its barley into ale sent its sons and brothers out in the warmer months, down to the river ports of the Baltic, along the Volga and deeper toward the Caspian markets and the walls of Constantinople. West to the Irish Sea and the trading towns of the Frankish coast, north to the Arctic whaling grounds, and out across the open Atlantic to Iceland and, in later generations, to Greenland and the shores of North America. Trade in furs, walrus ivory, amber, slaves, and silver kept a steady stream of foreign wealth flowing back into the Longhouse. Coins minted in distant caliphates have turned up buried under Scandinavian floors. The Longhouse wasn't just shelter from winter. It was the home port of a network spanning 3 continents. That world didn't last. Through the 10th century and into the 11th, royal power slowly consolidated in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Christianity spread up from the south and over from the British Isles. New ways of building, farming, and governing began replacing the old ones, and the Longhouse gradually became something else. The byre moved into its own building, the hearth migrated to a wall and grew a chimney. The single great hall split into smaller, more private rooms. Household gods gave way to parish churches. And the long, low, smoke-darkened building, turf walls, single fire, rows of sleeping farmers, kin and unfree workers survived only in the foundations archaeologists now read post-hole by post-hole from the soils of the North Atlantic. But in the year 900 that future was still a long way off. The fire was still burning at the center of the hall. The cattle were still in the byre. The loom still stood at the gable end. The ale was still in the cup. And around the hearth, through the long evenings of a Scandinavian winter, the verses that would one day become the sagas were still being spoken aloud into the smoke.